The lights inside the execution chamber are already on. The room is silent in a way that feels heavy, like even the air knows what's about to happen. Demetrius Terren Frasier is led inside. His hands are restrained, but no one is dragging him forward. His steps are slow on their own, deliberate, because this isn't just another walk. It's the last one he'll ever take. He lies down on the gurney. Straps are pulled tight across his chest, his arms, his legs. A clear mask is lowered over his face. Somewhere behind glass, witnesses wait, barely breathing. He's asked if he has any final words. For a moment, there's nothing. Then he speaks. He apologizes. He sends love. He mentions Detroit, the place where his life began. And when he's finished, he looks straight ahead and says two words that no one in that room will forget. Let's go. Minutes later, after nearly 3 decades on death row, Demetrius Terren Frasier is pronounced dead. No more appeals, no more delays, no more tomorrows. And that's the moment most people see. The headlines, the execution, the final breath. But that moment didn't come out of nowhere. The real question is this: how does a life end here? How does someone go from an ordinary beginning to a gurney, a mask, and a sentence carried out by the state? To understand that, you have to go back long before this room existed in the story, before the trials, before the protests, before the death sentence, back to when there was just a boy, and 2 states that would eventually collide in the most tragic way possible. Demetrius Terren Frasier wasn't born into chaos or notoriety. He was born in 1972 and raised in Michigan, in a life that, at least on the surface, looked unremarkable. No flashing warning signs, no headlines waiting to happen. Just a kid growing up in a place where thousands of other kids were doing the same. There was no single moment that screamed disaster. No clear line where everything suddenly snapped. And that's what makes this part of the story uncomfortable. Because whatever was forming did so quietly, out of sight, away from cameras and courtrooms. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Frasier was an adult, moving through life without attracting national attention. But behind closed doors, something had shifted. Law enforcement wouldn't realize it yet, but the early pieces were already falling into place. What looked like isolated incidents would later be recognized as the beginning of a pattern that didn't announce itself loudly. It crept in through unlocked doors, empty hallways, and moments when people thought they were safe. And while no one connected the dots at the time, investigators in more than one state were about to start noticing the same troubling details. Because whatever had begun in Michigan wasn't going to stay there for long. The early 1990s were a different world. No smartphones, no doorbell cameras, no instant alerts lighting up a screen the moment something went wrong. When crimes happened, they often unfolded in silence, and answers came slowly. In both Michigan and Alabama, police departments were dealing with cases that felt unsettlingly similar. Homes were being broken into. Women were being targeted in places where they should have felt safest. These weren't random smash and grabs. They felt deliberate, personal, planned. Investigators started noticing the same details appearing again and again. Entry points that suggested patience instead of panic. Attacks that escalated rather than ended quickly. Victims who were alone, caught completely off guard, with no chance to react. At the time, these cases lived in separate folders, in separate states, handled by separate departments that had no easy way to talk to each other. To the outside world, they looked unconnected. To the people living in those neighborhoods, They felt like something darker was moving through their communities. And while police searched for answers, one case in Michigan would soon force them to look closer than ever before. Because this time, the violence didn't stop. Michigan reached a breaking point when the violence finally turned fatal. One of the victims was a 14-year-old girl named Crystal Kendrick. Her life was taken in a way that left a community shaken and a family permanently changed. This wasn't fear anymore. This was loss, and it demanded answers. As investigators dug deeper, the evidence began to narrow. Witness statements, physical clues, a timeline that stopped pointing in every direction and started pointing at one person: Demetrius Terren Frasier. When the case went to trial, prosecutors laid everything out piece by piece. The jury listened, weighed the facts, and came back with a verdict that left no room for doubt. Guilty. The sentence was severe and final. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. No release date. No second chance. A decision meant to ensure he would never walk free again. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. Justice served, threat removed, chapter closed. But while Michigan believed it had locked the door for good, another state was still looking for the same man. And what Alabama would uncover would change everything. Hundreds of miles south, in Birmingham, Alabama, another life had already been destroyed. In 1991, Pauline Brown was 40 years old. She had routines, a home, a life that felt normal and predictable. Then one day, someone broke into her apartment. What followed was a nightmare that ended in the one place she should have been safest. Pauline was robbed. She was assaulted. And before the night was over, she was gone. The crime sent shockwaves through the community. Detectives worked the case relentlessly, combing through every detail they could find. Nothing was overlooked. No lead was too small to chase. Slowly, a picture began to form. Physical evidence, witness accounts, a timeline that didn't leave much room for coincidence. Piece by piece, it all pointed back to the same name: Demetrius Terren Frasier. The question wasn't just who did it anymore. It was how. How could someone tied to violence in Michigan also be responsible for a crime this brutal in Alabama? And as investigators started comparing notes across state lines, the answer became impossible to ignore. This wasn't one story. It was two stories colliding. In the early 1990s, moving between states made it easier to disappear than most people realize today. Police databases didn't talk to each other. Information traveled slowly. A person could leave one state, cross a few borders, and start over without raising immediate alarms. That gap is where everything unraveled. When investigators in Michigan and Alabama finally began sharing information, the similarities were impossible to dismiss. The timelines lined up. The behavior matched. The evidence pointed to the same man operating in two different places, leaving devastation behind him in both. Michigan had already secured its conviction. Frasier was serving life without parole. On paper, he was done. But Alabama wasn't bound by Michigan's sentence, because in Alabama, Pauline Brown's case carried a different weight. The charge wasn't just murder. It was capital murder. A killing committed during the course of another violent crime. And under Alabama law, that distinction meant only two possible outcomes: life in prison or death. When Frasier was brought back to Alabama to stand trial, the courtroom filled quickly. Families sat only feet away from the man accused of destroying their lives. Prosecutors presented their case with precision. The defense pushed back where they could. But when the jury retired to deliberate, they didn't stay gone long. guilty. And suddenly, what had started as a life sentence in Michigan was no longer the end of the road. It was just the beginning of something far more final. Once the sentence was handed down, time began to move differently. Demetrius Terren Frasier was transferred to Alabama's death row, locked inside Holman Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison built to hold men the state intended to execute. From that moment on, his life was measured not in years, but in appeals. Death row isn't fast. It isn't dramatic. It's a slow, grinding existence. A small cell, the same walls, the same routines, and the constant knowledge that someday the state plans to end your life. For Frasier, that wait stretched on for decades. 30 years of legal filings, 30 years of hearings and motions, 30 years of waking up every morning knowing there was an expiration date attached to his name, even if no one knew exactly when it would arrive. And while he waited, so did the families. Pauline Brown's loved ones waited through every delay and appeal, reliving the case again and again in courtrooms and legal briefs. Crystal Kendrick's family, back in Michigan, carried their own grief, knowing that no sentence could ever undo what had been taken from them. Justice in death penalty cases moves at a painful pace. It's slow, it's costly, and it never brings the kind of closure people hope for. Frasier's attorneys fought hard to keep him alive. They challenged the evidence. They questioned the fairness of the trial. They argued that his rights had been violated. And for years, those arguments worked. But one by one, the courts said no. And as the legal doors quietly closed, something else was changing behind the scenes. The way Alabama planned to carry out executions. By the time Frasier's appeals were nearly exhausted, Alabama had shifted in a way that put his case back under a national spotlight. For years, lethal injection had been the state's primary method. But after a series of problems and legal challenges, Alabama turned to something new, something far more controversial. A method few people fully understood. Nitrogen hypoxia. Instead of chemicals, the state planned to use pure nitrogen gas. The idea was simple in theory: remove oxygen from the body, cause unconsciousness, and bring life to an end. Officials claimed it would be quick and painless. Critics weren't convinced. Legal experts and advocacy groups called it untested, experimental, a dangerous step into unknown territory. They argued there was no real way to know what a person would experience once the gas began to flow. Frasier's legal team seized on that uncertainty. They filed last-minute motions, arguing the method itself violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. They warned that Alabama was about to perform a human experiment. But the courts didn't agree. In January of 2025, a federal judge cleared the final obstacle. The execution could move forward. The date was set: February 6, 2025. And once that date appeared on the calendar, there was nothing left to appeal. The countdown had begun. As February 6th approached, attention turned toward Holman Correctional Facility. Outside the prison walls, protesters gathered. Some called for an end to capital punishment altogether. Others demanded justice for Pauline Brown and the other victims, arguing that this moment had been delayed for far too long. Inside, Frasier prepared in his own way. He met with spiritual advisors, spoke with a chaplain, made final phone calls to family members, saying goodbye in sentences that couldn't possibly carry everything he wanted to say. On his last day, he declined the traditional prison meal. Instead, he chose something simple and familiar. Tacos, a burrito, chips, a soda. Small comforts in a situation with almost no control left. As evening approached, the final steps began. Just before 6 p.m. Central Time, Frasier was escorted from his cell. He wore a plain prison uniform. His hands were cuffed in front of him. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He walked slowly, fully aware of where he was going. The execution chamber was stark and clinical. A single gurney bolted to the floor, straps hanging loose, witnesses already seated behind glass. Frasier was guided onto the gurney. The restraints were secured one by one. Chest, arms, legs. Then the mask was placed over his face, fitted to deliver the nitrogen gas. The warden asked if he had any final words. After a brief silence, Frasier spoke. He apologized to Pauline Brown's family. He thanked people he had known on death row. He mentioned Detroit, the place where his life began. Then he looked straight ahead and said, "Let's go." The signal was given. The nitrogen began to flow. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his body reacted. Witnesses would later describe different things. Some said he went. In the hours that followed, the reaction split sharply. Alabama officials released statements calling the execution justice served, a promise finally fulfilled after decades of delays. Supporters of the death penalty said it was long overdue, that Pauline Brown's family had waited more than 30 years for accountability. Others saw it very differently. Advocates condemned the execution, calling it state-sanctioned violence, arguing that no government should have the power to take a life, no matter the crime. They pointed to the method, the long wait, the uncertainty, and asked whether any of it truly made society safer. But for the families, the reality was far more complicated. Pauline Brown's loved ones acknowledged relief that the legal process was finally over. But they also admitted what had always been true. Nothing could bring her back. No sentence, no execution, no ruling could undo what was taken from them. Crystal Kendrick's family carried their own quiet grief in Michigan. Some found comfort knowing Frasier would never hurt anyone again. Others felt only emptiness. Because closure in cases like this often turns out to be an illusion. 2 women were still gone. Families were still broken. And now, another life had ended at the hands of the state. The debate over the death penalty will continue long after Frasier's name fades from the headlines. People will argue about justice, morality, and whether consequences like this actually heal anything at all. But at its core, this story isn't about policy or politics. It's about choices. About a path that destroyed multiple lives, including the man who walked it. It's about victims who never got the chance to grow older, to see their futures, to come home. February 6th, 2025. A man entered a chamber. He lay down. He spoke his last words. And history recorded another execution. But behind that moment were decades of decisions, crimes, grief, and consequences. No winners. Just an ending that came far too late for some, and far too final for everyone.